How's it going, everyone? Connor here with the Diamond, and welcome to the very first episode of The Greatest Game I Ever Saw, the show where I talk to interesting people from around the baseball world and ask them about the greatest games they ever saw. Today on our first episode, we have a very special guest on the program, the Jolly Olive, whom you know as a baseball YouTuber, commenter, podcaster, a member of the Jomboy Media crew, and of course, one of the biggest Mets fans on the internet today. I sat down with him a couple weeks ago and I asked him a simple question. What was the greatest game you ever saw? And his answer, unsurprisingly, involved the Mets. Take a look. Jolly, thank you so much for coming on the show today. I really appreciate it, man.
Yeah, man, thank you for having me. As soon as you told me about this, I was excited to come on and share my story, if you will.
Well, we're glad to have you, man. So, we're going to be talking about Francisco Lindor's 3-home run game from this past season, 2021. But before we get into Lindor, the Mets, and their respective 2021s, I wanted to start by talking a little bit about your background, because you've obviously had a lot of success over the past year. 25,000 subs on YouTube, almost 6,000 followers now on Twitter. Of course, hosting one of the biggest Mets podcasts on the internet for Jomboy Media. You've built quite a following over the past year or so, and it's pretty easy to see why. You have such a clear passion for the game, for the topics you talk about, and especially the Mets. So, before we get into everything that we're going to be getting into later in this episode, I wanted to first start off our discussion by asking you how you first got interested in baseball in the first place, and how you came to be a Mets fan.
Yeah, that's always a great question to talk about just in general. I was a little bit late to the party for the Mets. I missed the 2006 season and the disaster 07 and 08 seasons because I was off being a kid or whatever. The big reason I got into baseball was my dad used to buy the Topps collection card every year, so I had all the baseball cards, and I played a lot of a game called MLB Power Pros. I don't know if you're familiar, but that was like my game growing up, and that's how I learned about all the players and got really into like stats and stuff like that, because they showed batting average and home runs, and I thought that was really cool. So it was just kind of having like a little bit of a math-oriented brain, and then being introduced to something that I actually found interesting to be paired with math, because at the time I didn't really enjoy math, but I knew I enjoyed numbers. I don't know if that makes sense, but those kind of two being paired together, and then the baseball cards thing kind of led me towards the Mets path that my dad had always been trying to lead me down in the first place.
Yeah, and that makes sense. And I totally get you on the math thing. Like, that was a big thing for me too. So, what was the first Mets season that you remember personally?
The first, I remember it very clearly, actually. It's 2009, which was basically the first year of the Mets entering like a wasteland of forgotten mediocre teams. I had just missed the bill on like the Carlos Beltran, Jose Reyes, David Wright Mets, and those guys began getting injured or traded or retiring, and I was introduced to a whole slew of guys that shouldn't be playing at a major league level, but these were the first ball players that I ever got attached to, so they still ring in my head, like Mike Baxter or Corey Sullivan, and I think that's like a big reason for why I make videos about guys that aren't household names. It's because the first ones that I grew attached to were guys that had like 5-year careers and were minor league journeymen and stuff like that.
And of course, the Mets during that time, their problems weren't limited to just being on the field, of course. You had the Wilpons, who were the owners for so many years, went through so many scandals. What was that like as a fan, having to deal with that year in and year out?
Yeah, when I was younger, I was just happy to watch the game. Like, I enjoyed the game of baseball itself, and obviously I wanted my team to win. But I don't think I really grasped how bad it was until the Mets made the World Series in 2015, and I was like, oh, I've never experienced anything like this, because I've only seen 70-win losing seasons, and I think, somebody's in charge, somebody has to be responsible for this, and that's what the first time I really looked into like front offices and like who's had a great track record, and I learned about Dave Dombrowski and all that stuff. So 2015 was kind of my awakening into the outer edge of baseball, not just the surface level like batting average, home runs, RBIs, and these guys are my favorites. It's like, oh, baseball is like, it has a lot of parts to it that go into making a successful team.
You really pulled back the curtain there and got to see the man behind the curtain there, the the Wizard of Oz, so to speak.
Yeah, exactly.
So you're starting to get into the front office side of things. You're starting to learn about the Wilpons and how things might not be so peachy on the ownership side. But coming out of the 2020 season, you have an array of possible hope coming in. The Wilpons are out, and all of a sudden here comes Steve Cohen. And now you have the single richest owner in Major League Baseball. So when that came about, were you extremely excited? Were you very optimistic like some Mets fans were? Or were you a little bit more on the skeptical side?
Yeah, I understand where some Mets fans are coming from in the current state of 2021 and how the skepticism of Steve Cohen has grown. But I think at the time, I think pretty much everybody was just happy to see somebody else other than the Wilpons at the helm because, like you had said before, it had been so long since anybody had been in charge that didn't have the last name Wilpon. And a lot of people, like myself, never thought we would live to see a day where the ownership changed hands because that's a very rare thing, especially with baseball clubs. A lot of baseball clubs have been in the same hands for decades upon decades at this point. So the changing of the guard there was a really encouraging sign, especially considering that Steve Cohen is a top 5 richest owner in all of sports and definitely the richest owner in baseball. Now, we're in year 2, and obviously we haven't seen the results that you want to see. But I'm more than willing to give him a few more years before I start, really coming down on him, I guess.
I mean, he did give you a 5-year window.
That's true, he did. He said 3 to 5 years, guys. 3 to 5 years.
But at least you guys got a little bit of a glimmer of what's to come, or at least hopefully what's to come, because the first big move he makes as the owner is to go out and get Francisco Lindor from the Cleveland Guardians. So I was just wondering if you remember where you were that night and what your initial thoughts were of that trade.
I had just joined baseball Twitter not too long ago. I'd say like 3 months ago. Was still kind of getting my footing in the content creation scene. And that was a big night for Mets Twitter. I think I refreshed Twitter maybe 1,000 times that night, and I was just glued to my phone. And there were inklings of things going around, and there was I think the lasagna that Steve Cohen bought Francisco Lindor, and then there were rumors that the deal was going to fall through and that they were only going to have him for the year, and then there was a bomb drop at I think like 11 p.m. or midnight, and it was jubilation because the Mets. I mean, I'm not crazy about max contract deals. I've seen a lot of them go south, especially like Albert Pujols and guys like that. But the Mets, it had been a while since the Mets made a titan move like that got the attention of the entire sports world. So it was exciting just off the notion of that.
And obviously you're trying to get the monkey off your back, because I think the last huge contract was probably, Bonilla maybe?
In terms of like length, yeah, I think Bonilla is up there. But in terms of like the size of the contract or the annual value, that was probably the DeGrom extension, I think. Which, say what you will about the Wilpons, that's a great deal.
Absolutely. I mean, anything you can do to keep Jacob DeGrom on your team is always going to be a good thing.
Right.
But I will say this though. I mean, obviously that first year of the Lindor deal wasn't exactly as planned. I have some of those stats written down here. Heading into the September 12th matchup that we're going to be talking about today, he had 106 games, 442 plate appearances. We're looking at a slash line of 222, 317, and 380 with 14 home runs. Not exactly ideal for your perennial all-star shortstop, and that's not getting into things like rat versus raccoon, the injury troubles toward the middle of the season, and of course, thumbs down gate with Javi Baez later in the year. So I just wanted to ask you a little bit about Lindor's 2021 and how you think it went from a fan perspective and from a general baseball perspective.
That's a good question to ask for both sides there. From a general baseball perspective, that's what I'll do first. The money, it's tough. $340 million is a lot to pay somebody, but Francisco Lindor's track record garnered that kind of contract, especially with this shortstop class. I understood why he got the contract. I'm glad he's a Met. You look at his defense, it's platinum glove caliber year in and year out. It was again in 2021. That's extremely valuable to have in a shortstop The Mets went to the 2015 World Series, and Wilmer Flores was their shortstop. He plays first base now. I mean, we've been soured on defense for many, many years, so I was excited for it just on that front. But yeah, the bat was definitely disappointing. You saw the regression in 2020. You thought maybe it was a fluke bubble year, but he just didn't have a strong showing in his first 4 months. You could acclimate it to maybe adjusting to the New York market or just adjusting to a new home. But the fact is he didn't play up to his caliber in those 4 months, and there was plenty of controversy, because controversy always follows the Mets regardless of what they're doing. So it obviously wasn't ideal. The team had been in first for many months, fell out of first, because that's what the Mets do. But in terms of souring on Lindor in year one of a 12-year contract, I wasn't in that boat quite yet. I was frustrated, for sure, but not completely writing him off. And that kind of bleeds into the fan perspective, which was having a guy like Francisco Lindor on your team is awesome. A lot of people can pretend that, Lindor is bad now, and I wouldn't want him anywhere near my team. But having Mr. Smile, such a recognizable face with such a dependable glove in the field, who's constantly making highlight reel plays, and is just fun to watch in general as a human being, is always a good thing to have on your team, just in general for morale and for fan interest and all of that.
Yeah, I think that really hits the nail on the head on really all fronts there. And by the way, in my opinion, I think he got robbed for the Platinum Glove, but that's just me.
Oh, yeah. That's all right.
Not the greatest defensive year for Arenado, but hey, I mean, the name gets you a lot there. Anyway, so just to paint the picture for you here, it's September 12th. The Yankees are coming across town to face the Mets at Citi. The Mets had just fallen to 71 and 72, one game under 500. They had just lost to the Yankees by 1 run in a heartbreaker the day before. And you have the other part of the Francisco Lindor deal, Carlos Carrasco, starting for you on the mound. First inning, immediately gives up 2 runs. How are you feeling at that point of the night? Which, by the way, are you in the ballpark for this game, or are you watching from home?
So yeah, that's a part I wanted to definitely tell about. I was obviously going to watch this game because everybody's going to watch the Subway Series. I didn't know I was going to the ballpark for this game until about 6 hours before, because I got a text from head honcho Jomboy, and he told me he had an extra ticket, so I got to go along with him, Jake, and BBD, which was a lot of fun. Met a lot of great people, a lot of fans, had a lot of fun, and I kept telling them. Because they don't watch a ton of Mets games. They try and catch it when it's on, but they're Yankees fans, obviously. And I tried to tell him, Cookie is a terrible pitcher in the first inning, and he's been great outside of that. Fully expect your Yankees to get 1 or 2 runs and for the place to fall into a bonanza. And that's exactly what happened, because he had done that in the past 3 or 4 starts. So I wasn't shocked, and I knew that, we were coming off the heels of a back-and-forth game that we had just lost, so I knew this offense had a little bit of juice.
Yeah, and it definitely seemed like it was going to be a lot of the same in this game, because obviously the Mets come back, they score 1 in the very next inning. Lindor was a part of that as well. He gets on a ground out, and he scores on a single. What was your expectation for the Mets heading into this game? Obviously, the season hadn't gone up to your expectation. Up to that point, it's probably safe to say, but they had just had that back-and-forth game. Were you expecting a bit of a dogfight here, or were you expecting them to kind of come out a little flat and let the Yankees come out?
Yeah, I mean, so we're still technically in the hunt at this point. It's 71 and 72. Obviously, the light is fading a bit, for sure. But it's the Subway Series, and every year, even when the Mets were a mediocre team, the Subway Series have always managed to be fun to watch. I can't recall the last time I've been sort of watching a dud Subway Series game. And this series was no different. The game before was really fun to watch. The Mets took game 1 of the series. I remember that as well. So I fully expected them to try and claw out a series win, just because they had been kind of on a tailspin ever since that nightmare West Coast trip. So I had a lot of faith in the boys.
And it seems like your faith was definitely rewarded just right off the bat there, because immediately in the bottom of the second, Lindor hits his first of the night. It's a 3-run shot off of Clark Schmidt, which, by the way, it's probably safe to say the Yankees weren't throwing their best out there. I mean, you had your first 2 pitchers were, I think, Clark Schmidt and Wandy Peralta for the Yankees. So not exactly the best pitching out there, but still had to feel good seeing Lindor get a big hit like that in the Subway Series.
Yeah, I fully expected it to be a high-scoring affair just because of the matchup on the bump between Cookie, who was slumping, and Clark Schmidt, who has sort of become a meme in Yankees fandom. But that was really nice to see because I had been to like 10 Mets games that year, and I had not seen Lindor get an extra base hit in like any of them, and that was a rocket. So that was very cool to see. It was kind of tough to celebrate, and this will be a common theme because I was at the game
Right.
with 6 new friends, all of whom who were Yankees fans. So I was kind of just celebrating with strangers, and then coming back to them and being like, "Sorry, guys."
So you couldn't be your full self, your full Mets fan self there, is what you're saying.
Not at that point, but once it got a little bit later into the game, I couldn't really contain it.
I mean, yeah, and obviously we'll get into that, but it seemed like, it seemed like a typical start to the game, so I don't blame you at all for trying to keep things at least a little bit contained, at least for that moment. And especially because later on in the game, things start to get more toward that back and forth environment that we were talking about earlier. I mean, obviously Lindor hits his second of the night in the 6th inning, makes it a 6-4 game for the Mets, but here come the Yankees right back. You get a 2-run home run off of Familia to Gleyber Torres, and then in the 7th, the Mets give up that lead. Game's tied at 6 off a 2-run home run by Giancarlo Stanton. Huge 2-run home runs in back-to-back innings in the later part of the game. It seemed like a big theme of the Mets season this year. So how were you feeling in those 5th through 7th innings toward that meat and potatoes part of the game where the Mets were starting to kind of show signs of cracks?
Yeah, so the Mets bullpen, who had been very solid all year, was having a pretty bad stretch after the Giants-Dodgers series that had gone by. And I remember distinctly Brad Hand being left in to face Giancarlo Stanton instead of walking him. And I could have told you that he was going to hit a home run, and I think everybody around me was telling me that he was going to hit a home run, and then he did. And I wasn't shocked, and I saw the reactions of Jim and Jake and Dave, and they were obviously all ecstatic and happy and celebrating and laughing a little bit at my Mets. And I was like, all right, I'll keep that in mind. We might lose this game, but if we jump back out in front, I'm going to be loud as I possibly can.
Yeah, I mean, and obviously, like, that's just how the rivalry works, right? Like, you guys get one up on them, the next guys get up on them. Like, the Yankees and Mets always go back and forth like this. So, obviously, the reaction there from them is warranted. I mean, it's a huge moment of the game, but did you feel like the Mets had, like, a little bit left in the tank? Did you think they were going to come back in those last few innings and actually pull it off?
I think as soon as the skirmish happened on the field over whatever the stupid whistling thing is, and we don't need to get into that because it became absolutely nothing. But as soon as that skirmish happened and Brett Gardner's doing thumbs down and Javi's barking and Francisco Lindor's barking, I was like, this game, there's no way this game is just going to go quietly. We still have 2 innings left. Like, there's so much baseball left to play, and we both have shaky closers, and like there are going to be more runs in this game regardless. So obviously, I had my faith.
Yeah, and obviously, it just seemed like it was the culmination of a lot of very bizarre storylines across that New York marketplace between the whistling and the thumbs down and the antagonistic environment towards the fans and from the fans to the players as well. Like, it just seemed like all of that came together in that skirmish. So I know you said you didn't want to get into it, but did you want to talk a little bit about that before we moved on?
Yeah, I mean, the only thing I remember about it is Jim's reaction, because as soon as it was happening and we figured out it was whistling, he was like, oh, fuck, I'm going to have to do a breakdown on this, and I hate doing breakdowns on whistling. And I was like, yeah, like, there's nothing here, but, like, I wanted to know what was happening. And we were in the stands. We don't have the commentators, and I'm not really checking Twitter because I'm at the game, so I have no idea what's going on. I don't figure out what's going on until after the game has ended and I'm back home. So it was kind of fun, just being a little bit left in the dark and only knowing that these two teams are just barking at each other for a reason you're not really aware of. So I enjoyed it from that perspective.
So now we head into the bottom half of the 8th inning. It's a tie ball game. Obviously, the crowd is still very much into it. The Yankees fans are hoping for a Mets collapse. the Mets fans are hoping that there's still a little bit of spark alive both in the game and in their playoff hopes. Francisco Lindor, he has 2 home runs in the game so far, scored 3 runs, pretty much responsible for 5 of the 6 runs that were already scored in that game to that point. Did you have a feeling that he was going to go yard again? Was there a feeling in the ballpark that this was just meant to be?
Normally, I try and stray away from the thoughts of fate and like what should happen in the storybook writing of a game. But that all changed when I saw Chad Green take the mound. Just because, I watched the 2017 ALDS. I saw the Lindor Grand Slam off Chad Green. I know about their history. I know he hits well against him. And I didn't love the move, just because Chad Green was kind of in a bad stretch at that time as well. And as soon as I saw him come out, I think the guys around me were dreading a little bit. And that kind of made me feel like, oh, okay, I'm not alone in thinking that there's a little bit of magic in the air right now.
What was their reaction like when Lindor was stepping up to the plate? Like, did they know? Did anybody say anything when that matchup came about?
I think it was like timid fear. I don't think anybody wanted to like speak it into existence because then it became real. And I treated none of us are like talking and having conversation right now. We're standing with clamped fists and like just like watching intently for every bit of action that we can get. But in our minds, I'm sure it's circulating.
Yeah. So we get into the at bat. Chad Green versus Francisco Lindor, and Lindor hits a long fly ball to right field. Walk me through what you were feeling as that ball was leaving the yard.
My spectator eye has gotten a lot better from going to 10 games this year. I used to always think that every fly ball was gone, but that ball I knew was gone as soon as it left the bat. And I didn't even look back at the Jomboy guys that I was with. I instantly ran to some Mets fans that I did not know that were in my section because I had never seen anything like that in an in-person game. I'd seen a lot of Mets losses. I'd seen a Mets playoff loss. I had never seen a Subway Series game that entertaining. And it's unfair to Yankees fans, but it's just kind of a common theme that every game of the year candidate somehow always involves the Yankees losing. Like every entertaining game is always just an underdog team who's projected under them to come back and beat them. In 2020, the game I remember most is the Mike Purcell home run, and that's the Yankees losing. You also had the Field of Dreams game, and that's the Yankees losing. And I remember this game a lot, and it's the Yankees losing. And I don't have any hate for the Yankees. I always say that I root for the Yankees because my end goal is a Subway Series World Series. But when the two teams come to meet up, obviously, you got to root for the Mets, and you got to hate on the Yankees. So that was extremely satisfying for me, especially in what had been such a frustrating stretch of games for this club. And I kind of knew in that moment, again, an unspoken thing that sort of I just came to a realization that the season was like over. And that was kind of like a little gift to me. Like 2021 was an absolute dud. We choked away the lead again. I kind of knew we weren't going to make it back. We just didn't have the juice. But to get such a memorable moment for a guy that had such a difficult year to sort of erase a lot of the notions that had been written about him in year one was very nice for me as a fan. So, I mean, whatever happens with Lindor in 2022 and on, who knows? But he'll always have this. It'll always be ingrained in Mets history because it's that much of an iconic win, even though it's just a regular season game that ended up meaning pretty much nothing.
Absolutely. And obviously it had to have been worth it just to see the reactions on Jomboy and Jake and BBD, all of their faces as you went back and got to go back to your seat after that home run. What was that experience like? What was the reaction? What was the vibe?
I was still relatively new at that point, but I mean, I couldn't hold back the happiness. And, I was like, I told them, sorry, guys. And I knew the game wasn't over. We still had Edwin Diaz for the bottom of the ninth. This game is not locked down by any means. I think they knew that, too. They were still watching intently. But, coming into the game and watching your team, give up something like that seismic home run where the stadium is just ear-piercingly loud, you can't help but to be pin drop silent in that moment. So there wasn't much to say between us, and I kind of just, soaked in the moment. I took a little film of the moment and just enjoyed it as much as I could.
Yeah, and really that's all you can do, especially when you have Edwin Diaz coming in the very next inning. So what was that experience like? How, on a scale of 1 to 10, how on edge were you listening to the trumpets, watching him come in, watching him warm up, and starting to go at these Yankee hitters?
There's a couple factors with Edwin. If you follow my Twitter, I'm an Edwin Diaz defender. I think he's a good relief pitcher. I think he's had some tough luck, especially in 2019, that kind of just stuck him with this poor reputation. But hearing the trumpets always gets you hyped up, and I think it's really hinging on how his first batter goes. And I don't recall exactly what he did with his first batter, but I do remember him being pretty erratic in his first few batters, and I remember a runner getting to scoring position and Giancarlo Stanton coming up, and regardless of who you have on the mound, you could have Trevor Hoffman on the mound. If Stanton comes up with the tying run on base and he's swinging the bat like he had been that night, you're going to be nervous. Like, there's just no way around it.
Yeah, absolutely. But he does get the job done. He gets through the inning clean. Mets win 7-6, and obviously the vibe at Citi Field must have just been immaculate at that point. You win the series, obviously a huge win in general for the ball club to get back to 500 and hopefully keep those playoff hopes alive, but had to feel that much sweeter getting it against the Yankees.
Yeah, and it was kind of like a christening moment for me, because I remember Shea Station had two very popular back-to-back episodes with the Subway Series preview and then the show after where we won, and it was kind of just Mets fans coming together to bask in this minor small victory in what was otherwise a kind of disappointing season. But taking the season Subway Series is always a lot of fun, because more often than not I feel like we always just split 3-3. So winning 4-2, I can get some bragging rights up until 2022, and that's redeemable up until then. So it's pretty nice.
And at the end of the day, that's all that matters.
It's all that matters.
So before we end things here today, I want to go back to Lindor specifically, because obviously huge moment for him individually. I mean, 3 home run game after just 14 the rest of the season before that point. Obviously, it had to feel a little bit like his first real game as a Met. Like, it felt like his initial... It had to feel like he finally became a Met that night. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I'd mentioned the word christening before, and I think it really applied to Lindor there, because, you try and recall highlights from the 2021 season. When you think of Lindor, you think of this game. And I think this kind of it catapulted him in the last kind of meaningless month of the season. He was able to get his OPS plus above 100. He actually ended up getting to 20 home runs. Mm-hmm. So when we look back on this season and you see that stat line, it doesn't jump off the page, but it doesn't really speak volumes to the struggles he had in those first 4 months. 100%. It just kind of looks like a lukewarm standard season. And I'm hoping that can help him kind of shed the reputation that sort of followed him around in his first year and just start anew in 2022 and on, because it's a long contract. You have a lot of time to start anew and figure things out and get your footing, and Lindor needs to shake off 2021 as much as possible, and it's much harder to do that without an iconic moment with your new team like the one he had in the Subway Series game.
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess the question is, do you think he's going to have that bounce back in 2022?
I do. I definitely do. I think that having Javier Baez hopefully for the entire year, because I think the Mets are the favorites to sign him, I think that'll be a huge factor. I think that there was just a revolving door of front office changes and a shitload of injuries at the beginning of the season that kind of kneecapped any chance at chemistry between the team when those injured guys came back. It was just too many things went wrong, and too many games were left out, but that could have been won. And I think that, getting a fresh slate next year, a new manager, things may not work out, but I think Lindor, for him, it'll be like a fresh start.
All right. Well, I think that's a good note to end on. Jolly Olive, thank you so much again for jumping on the show today. I really appreciate it. Loved having you on, talking a little bit about the Mets, and I'm hoping for your sake that you'll have a little bit more to celebrate in 2022.
Yeah, me too, man. Makes talking about the team twice a week pretty easy. So
absolutely. Thank you once again.